We set aside this Sunday, the third in the month of January in the year of our Lord 2023, to honor the memory of Martin Luther King Jr., who was a very great American indeed. This reading from Amos was one of his favorites, from chapter 5 in the book of Amos. I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. But let justice roll down like water, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Bearing witness. I pray you'll permit me a moment of self-reflection. In the 46 years it has been my privilege, pleasure, and honor to teach, I come to the concluding semester of it all wistfully. But my spirit is at ease. The time before me turns my attention inexorably to the time now spent, the times long past in which I endeavored to make sense of the world and all its paths, the way of science and the trail of art. As much for me as for all the minds and hearts that became my charge, I attempted to stay the course without tiring and without excuse to secure what is true, what is beautiful, and what is good. In all this time, I had but one prayer: to do no harm, but with one exception: to break free the mind from bondage to ignorance, prejudice, and the failure of imagination. I do not suppose I have always succeeded in what I had hoped, but I have set my mind at rest, that I gave in every instance the last full measure of what I prized most highly over bombast, pedantry, and sophistry. For after all, my students and I have suffered the many assaults of arguments poorly made, opinions thoughtlessly forged, and national policies instituted, but woefully ill-informed and unmindful of history, psychology, or even biology. In my teaching, I have attempted to make my students more sensitive to the interdependence of all the disciplines, the discrete areas of learning that make a man and a woman more acutely aware of the world without and the world within. In those moments, when the realization settles in the spirit of some student that all knowledge is interconnected and interconnected, I have felt my own spirit lifted to something very akin to joy. When a student becomes intoxicated with the thrill of learning, so that it becomes her chief ambition and his highest goal, I will enthuse with them that Aristotle was right after all. All men by nature desire to know. When first I undertook the rigors of teaching nearly a half century ago, I would have insisted that knowledge in its infinite expanse, both broad and deep, was worthy of our every effort to secure it for its own sake. The only reason for pursuing knowledge was for knowledge alone and nothing more. For as I saw it then, there was nothing more exalted, more sacred even, more inspiring than knowledge in its supreme and purest form, wisdom. But knowing, however rarefied it might be, has its divine correlate in doing. In the practical deployment of wisdom, the better to remake the world, to right it on its axis if it leans toward falling into perdition. For I am convinced something corrosive, something poisonous, toxic and all devouring, something monstrous wants to destroy this world. It pants and snarls growls and gnaws at the fringes of creation to untie its holy knotting and to unthread its woven beauty. It wants to nullify God's holy order, to throw the cosmos into chaos once again. Its minions show themselves unbridled and unashamed of the wickedness they foment. One of these has become the source of America's deepest, most persistent discontent: racism. I ask you all, please resist the urge to ignore the evil unleashed upon us, lo, the many years since before our nation came to be born. Racism is real in our world, and ignoring it only emboldens it all the more. Banning books is but one manifestation of our affliction, as though erasing Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye would save our children rather than throw them into the fire of race hatred and self-immolation. When I saw that racism did not care that I was well educated, properly groomed, articulate, and well disposed toward my neighbors, it appeared to me that something more than knowledge for knowledge's sake my students must absorb. What remedies could we bring to bear in the relations of men to women and women to men? What measures could we create to ensure that they would flourish before their natural gifts and graces were uprooted and turned to dust? And then it came to me in a flash that I collided with racism when but a student myself some 55 years ago. This, my story, a story of King, I wish to tell. I was haunted by my failure to master German in my first year of college, and as I labored alone in my dorm room without clarity over the subjunctive case, I paused to seek respite in soda and a bag of potato chips. I went to the TV lounge to harass the Coke machine and to assault the dispensary for chips, cakes, and sandwiches. The concessions were located in the rear of the lounge, so the young men sitting there watching the black and white screen high and lifted up on its pedestal never noticed when I entered as the news began to blare. Walter Cronkite, Uncle Walter, as many Americans had come to refer to him, broke in to interrupt the normally scheduled broadcast to announce that earlier that day, the noted civil rights worker and Nobel Prize recipient, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., had been shot and killed in Memphis, Tennessee. I stood at the back of that room as an invisible hand grabbed me about the throat. I could not speak, for I could hardly breathe. I was seized with a sense of panic I can still feel to this very day, but instead of bolting from the room as my instincts dictated, my limbs could not move. Paralyzed, I stood there staring at the screen and hoping the 20 or so young white men seated in the room would not see me unarmed, unthreatening, and naked in my colored skin. I did not run because I did not wish to draw attention to myself or my fear. I stood instead and prayed for the best. What I did not know then, but I knew better after time, was that God's best is rarely what you consider best. Exercise caution, therefore, when you pray. You may receive the answer you least expect. Just then, the heat on my cheek traveled to my brow. My fear was overwhelmed by anger as those young men began to cheer that King had been killed. They hooted, they hollered, and rejoiced that what all of them had thought would happen had finally come to pass. King was dead, bushwhacked by a carbine rifle as he stood upon the motel balcony with his deputies and lieutenants. Amid their glee and revelry, one young man in the very last row, the one nearest to me where I stood, chanced to turn about and saw me. He saw me. Not in a stare, but a glance. That moment changed everything in the blink of an eye, for it was only a blink of his eye that made that young man pretend that he had not seen me at all. But I knew he had, and so did he. He slumped down in his chair, edged his neighbor with his elbow, and with a feint of his head, but without a word, directed his attention to the guy behind them standing there with a soda in one hand and a pathetic bag of Lay's potato chips in the other. The stoutest weapons I have ever wielded in all my life. He too looked to see the black kid, thin and short, with the first bloom of thin whiskers showing on his chin. I had no power to quiet their din of exultation over the fact that a man who risked his all for the sake of peace was struck down by a man who wanted hell on earth instead. But then it happened. So strange and uncanny a thing I had not expected. The second boy's reaction was the same as the first. He hunched his shoulders and pretended he had not seen me. I say it seized me as a thing uncanny because as the unspoken news began to spread throughout that room, from boy to boy, that one black boy was in the room to bear them witness, the tumult of their celebrations over what that nigga deserved became quiet, eerily still, as though buried in a tomb. Now, since I could not run, I made up in my mind that I had willed myself not to run. In King's death was revealed to me a secret power he bequeathed to me. He was 39, and I was 17, but I have carried it with me all these years. Men and women have a conscience, if they but listen and obey its call. God has written in their minds and inscribed it upon their hearts that they bear the imprint of God's grace and God's love and God's will that justice be done. When we fail to do it, we know it, though we hide from our fault and failure to abide in God's law to love. A witness makes it that much harder to run from one's sin and crisscrossed heart. On that day, 55 years ago, in April, I stood and bore witness as Cronkite went on with the details of King's assassination. I bore witness to all my fellow students assembled in the TV lounge in Patterson Hall at Slippery Rock University. Each fell silent and one by one left the TV lounge until I stood there all alone. I surmised then, and have concluded since, that the sting of conscience was too great to bear before so powerful a witness as one small black boy. I drew one conclusion under the glare of fluorescent lighting overhead. My invisibility would not serve me nor anyone else if God had anything to do with it. I smiled to myself, took a seat close to the TV screen and said, "What do you think about that?" In the remembrances of King that followed in the days and the weeks and the months that followed, his famous speeches, addresses, and sermons were broadcast over and over again. I have a dream. I have a dream. Now's the time. All of us have our favorites, but this one suits me most now as the end of my teaching career draws near. Why did I teach and what was the highest aim? I still prize wisdom above everything. I still think knowledge is its own reward, but only because wisdom will make us just, and only justice tempered with love can save the world. If you don't believe me, just listen to Amos with King's ear for prophecy, poetry, and song. Let justice roll down like mighty waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Amen.